Spike rolled through the gap, just barely making it through by the scales of his teeth. Emerging into an empty hallway that seemed to run parallel to the one he'd just been in. There was a dead end to his left, and the secret passage quickly disappeared around a corner to his right. He could hear hoofsteps and the muffled cries coming from that direction, so he gave chase, following Cheerilee as stealthily as possible. He followed them around like this for a few minutes, always taking care to be one corner behind, when a high-pitched scream rang out throughout the corridors. He instantly broke into a sprint and rounded the next corner. Climbing the stairs, he was surprised to find there.
"No! You fiend! How could you?" Rarity yelled as Spike lifted his head above the final step,
Peeking into the room beyond. The room appeared to have a square shape, but due to poor lighting conditions, only the middle of the room could be seen clearly. Rarity was sitting on some kind of wooden throne, her legs bound by chains, and the chains around her forelegs first went through little rings connected to the armrest, where they went up to the ceiling, while those around her hind legs disappeared through holes in the ground instead. Cheerilee was standing in front of her, and Spike immediately saw what had caused Rarity's outrage. The fuchsia-colored mare wasn't only holding her at knife point this time. She had taken possession of a sizable chunk of Rarity's mane as well. Spike's anger seethed inside of him. A messed-up mane didn't bother him much personally, but he knew how much Rarity cared about appearances. "What? Was that your boyfriend said again? Too bad he's not here to see just how many hairs on your head I'm hurting." Cheerilee's laughter echoed throughout the ruins, and Spike's blood finally came to a boil. "You leave Rarity alone!" he shouted as he charged forward from his hiding place. Cheerilee turned around, but she didn't have time to brace herself against Spike's attack, as the little guy rammed into her head first. She grunted as the air got knocked out of her lungs, and she staggered backwards, clenching a hoof to her chest. The ridge on Spike's head was deceptively hard, and she could already feel a bruise setting in. "Spike! Watch over her knife!" Rarity yelled, somewhat unnecessarily. "So, the pet has come to bite after all," Cheerilee hissed. "Why is your owner not showing up herself? Does she enjoy letting a little baby do the work for her?" "Hey, you leave Twilight out of this," Spike said as he balled his fists. "She just couldn't make it through, that's all." Cheerilee broke out into a smile, and Rarity sighed. She hadn't expected Spike to be that stupid. "Well, thanks for telling me that. Now, I don't even have to watch my back," Cheerilee said, mockingly, as she readied her knife and lunged forward. Spike was taken by surprise, and the knife hit straight in the chest. Yet, it didn't manage to penetrate his scales. All it did was give him a nasty scare, as he slid back a meter or so. Cheerilee stared at the tip of her knife incredibly, and Rarity let out a sigh of relief. "This is why you never mess with a dragon," Spike said cockily. "I only see a mutt," Cheerilee hissed back. The two of them circled each other for a few moments, as they looked for an opening. Normally, Cheerilee would have been quite excited, but Spike's dragonic heritage was a turn-off. There just wasn't much fun to be had in fighting some pony that didn't even bleed properly when you stabbed them. Cheerilee lunged forwards once more, but this time the little dragon was ready for it. He belched out a jet of green fire, and Cheerilee just barely managed to dodge out of the way of it. Even then, a few tongues of the flame caressed the right side of her face ever so briefly, and she cringed as the smell of burnt hair mixed with that of scorched flesh hit her nose. She brought a hoof up to the small burn on her cheek as she stared at the little dragon in disbelief. "You did not just..." "Oh, yes I did. Oh, yes he did," Rarity yelled. "You go, my little spiky wikey." Spike grinned smugly, ready to go for another round, as they began to circle each other once more. Cheerilee pretended she was about to lunge once again, when in fact she jumped to the side and bucked her hind legs at the dragon. Spike was taken completely off guard by the mare's sudden change in tactics, and the kick sent him careening to the wall, right next to the staircase he had climbed up before. "Spike, get up! She's coming!" Rarity yelled from her seat, furious at her role as impotent witness. By the time he managed to scramble back to his feet, Cheerilee was almost upon him again. He drew in a large, deep breath, reflexively, intent on sending another jet of flames her way, but Cheerilee never fell for the same trick twice. She rammed her foreleg under his chin, slamming him into the wall. He let out a little rustle, and some little flames escaped his mouth, but nothing that could seriously threaten Cheerilee. He clawed at her leg, trying to let her go, but she was made of sterner stuff. Some baby dragon's scratches wouldn't considerably inconvenience her. "Let's see how well those scales fare this time, shall we?" Cheerilee said sadistically, ignoring Rarity's clamoring. Because she was so close, Cheerilee could clearly make out the individual scales that made up Spike's armor, which blended together too well to be seen from a distance. She grinned as he tried to get loose, and she tried to force her knife in between two scales on the left side of his chest. She managed to wiggle it in and levered it upwards, attempting to dislodge the scale. Spike let out a choked scream as it popped out, and Cheerilee immediately got to work on the next few. It didn't take her long at all when she got going, so she had soon created a vulnerable patch of flesh quite quickly. To her, he was still hardly bleeding at all. Yet another reason for her to despise dragons. "I'm ending this boring charade," she said, matter-of-factly, as she prepared to plunge the knife straight into his heart. "The other 5 were a lot more exciting than you." "Yeah, why?" Spike managed to let out hoarsely as he clawed weakly and kicked his feet, but to no avail. "Spiky, please, spare him!" Rarity cried out as she fought against the chains. "Do what you want to me, but spare Spike!" "But you see, what I really want," Cheerilee said, as she stared into the little dragon's eyes, "is to see your reaction when Spike dies." Rarity screamed as Cheerilee stabbed forward, plunging the dagger deep into the left side of Spike's chest. Blood welled up from around the blade, and dripped down her hoof, until she finally pulled back and let go of his neck, allowing him to slide down to the floor. He let out a hacking cough, and spit up a mouthful of blood. "Spike! No!" Spike clenched a hand to his chest, attempting to stop the bleeding. He looked at the blood seeping through his fingers, and felt weaker by the second. "Rarity," he whispered. "Save your strength, Spike. Please," the white unicorn implored. No. Listen. You need to hear this," he replied, his voice getting weaker by the second. "Spike, please." I've always loved you, Spike said as his hands fell down next to his body and his eyes fell shut, his breathing slowly stopping. I know. I love you too," Rarity said, surprise overcoming her voice as she realized it was true. She had planned to say it to smooth him, but she suddenly realized it had been true all along. "Spike, I love you. I love you, Spike. Spike? Spike?" Cheerilee nudged him with a hoof, but there was no response. She shrugged at Rarity. "No!" the white mare screamed. "Wake up! Please! Wake up! You have to! You have to wake up, Spike! You can't!
leave me now. Now that I know what we...
Finally. I thought he'd never die, Cheerilee said, as she casually kicked his limp body down the stairs, causing it to roll all the way down to the bottom.
You animal!
Rarity yelled, as tears streamed down her face, followed up with just about every insult ever conceivable by pony kind. Cheerilee rolled her eyes. She had heard most of them by now already, and it was getting quite tiring. She walked over to the side of the room and let the mare's insults wash over her, as unaffected by them as a rock by a splash of water. She briefly disappeared into the shadows that dominated the edge of the room, only to re-emerge a few moments later, holding a hammer between her teeth and pushing a wooden wedge along the floor. "I'm amazed you never got along with Applejack," Cheerilee said as she stepped in front of the other mare, grabbing hold of the piece of wood and putting the hammer underneath her free hoof. "You have so much in common." "Like what?" Rarity sneered. "You both talk too much." Rarity opened her mouth to respond, and Cheerilee immediately jumped into action. She rammed the wooden wedge into the unicorn's mouth, keeping it there with one hoof, as she picked the hammer up with the other. Getting up onto her hind legs, the wedge was too thick to really fit into Rarity's mouth, and her teeth scraped against it on both sides as she tried to turn her head. But the pressure Cheerilee exercised upon the wedge kept her squarely trapped in place. On top of that, the piece of wood pushed her jaws away from each other, slightly, which was most uncomfortable. Cheerilee lifted her hammer, and the smile on her face could only be described as diabolical. Rarity screamed, unable to properly articulate, her mouth being as full as it was. Cheerilee struck the wedge as hard as she could, driving it deeper into Rarity's mouth, and forcing her jaws even further apart. The unicorn screamed unintelligibly, as her jaw muscles were stretched beyond their limit, tearing internally. Cheerilee did not relent, banging the hammer against the wedge time and time again, driving it deeper with every blow. Rarity's teeth scraped over the wood, creating several grooves on the top and bottom of the wedge, but that ultimately did not stop its advance. Several of her teeth got embedded into the wood, and were torn right out of her mouth, either staying stuck in the wedge or tumbling out onto the floor. By now, Rarity's coat had gone red with her blood in so many places that Cheerilee was sure she wouldn't have recognized her at all if she saw her like this in the streets. The wedge started to dig into the corners of the unicorn's mouth, and eventually it just tore straight through them, stopping only because it hit the bone of her jaw. Rarity's screams became even more warped, to the point where they could hardly be labeled as screams anymore, more closely resembling the squealing of a gutted pig. Blood ran down her neck, and every swing of the hammer bashed her head into the back of the chair. Her jaw started to chip, and the wedge forced its way into the cracks. The unicorn's pain was so intense that even crying required too much coordination for her brain to handle, and Cheerilee lined the hammer up for what was to be her most monumental swing yet. And monumental it was. The wedge was driven straight through the last thing keeping the lower jaw in place, and both the jaw and the wedge lost all of their support. They fell down along Rarity's body, landing in a puddle of yellow liquid, which was rapidly expanding around Rarity's hooves, and which Cheerilee backed away from. Rarity's body shook. Her tongue hung down limply against her neck as blood flowed through her mouth. With her entire lower jaw gone, Cheerilee could almost stare straight down her throat, and the rest of her mouth had been ravaged as well. Over half the teeth of the upper jaw were missing, and the ones she still had were either partially broken or sticking out of bloody gums at odd angles. "I hope you like smoothies," Cheerilee said mockingly as she walked behind the chair, taking care not to step in the puddle. Rarity wailed as tears mingled with her blood, unable to let out more than a sort of low, gurgling sound that reminded Cheerilee of a toilet not flushed properly. "I guess that's, not really," Cheerilee said as she peeked out above the back of the chair. "But hey, cheer up. I never intended to give you a last meal, anyway." She dropped back down and rummaged through the storage compartment she had been built into the back of the chair, looking for the right tools for the next job. She'd found similar storages all over the complex, and while they were hard to find, they were quite convenient once discovered. She reappeared in front of Rarity, or rather diagonally to her side, oozing around the puddle the unicorn had excreted, brandishing a pair of metal tongs that looked like two spoons connected to each other. "So, I know you were secretly keeping an eye on Spike, but he doesn't need it anymore. So, you don't mind if I take it, right?" she said with a grin as she checked the two sides of the tongs together a few times. Rarity squealed again and tried to turn her face away, but the messy tuft of hair left on Rarity's head was more than enough for Cheerilee to grab hold of. And so she quickly forced her head back into the right position. Rarity attempted to delay the inevitable by keeping her eyes shut, but that was only a minor inconvenience. Cheerilee simply put the tongs into position around the mare's right eye and pushed, not particularly caring if the eye was open or not. The upper tong simply dragged the eyelid along as it popped into the socket, while the bottom eyelid got tore off its entirety. With the tongs securely in place around the eyeball, the job was already half done, and the pressure on Rarity's eye was immense. Her screams had gotten a lot more high-pitched, but Cheerilee wasn't sure if that was because of the pain or because she was forced to bear witness to the exclusion of her own eye through that very eye. Cheerilee pulled back. The red-hot pain exploded in Rarity's mind as her eye was ripped out, ocular nerve and all. Cheerilee held the bloody thing up triumphantly as Rarity screamed wordlessly, struggling against her chains out of a reflexive desire to push her hooves up against its now empty eye socket. "See, Rarity, that wasn't so bad, now was it?" the teacher cackled. "We could do the other one as well. What do you say?" Cheerilee burst into laughter over her own jokes as Rarity started to scream out of blind, or perhaps half-blind, fear, desperately struggling to get loose. But even though her blood had made the chain slippery, her cuffs were still as solid as ever. "No, you're right," Cheerilee said, pondering as she regained control of herself. "You are indeed boring me to death." Cheerilee briefly walked away to deposit the eye into the jar that she had been carrying around with her, and then walked right back again. Rarity cringed as Cheerilee drew closer, but the fuchsia-colored mare just started messing around with the metal rings on the armrests, which the chains around her forelegs passed through before they disappeared into the ceiling. To Rarity's great surprise, the teacher actually got the chains out of the rings, allowing the unicorn a much greater amount of freedom than before. She instantly clasped her hooves against her pounding eye socket, before moving on to touch the rest of her face. Of course, an action she immediately regretted. To Rarity's great relief, Cheerilee walked away and went to the other side of the room. This relief, however, was quite short-lived, as she suddenly got hoisted up into the air by the chains around her forelegs, dangling a meter or so off the ground. Cheerilee came back to push the chair out of the way, and replaced it with a big wooden wedge, which was pointed upwards, and which had been mounted upon four metallic legs. She positioned it straight underneath the unfortunate unicorn. "I'm thinking with wedges, right now. I hope you don't mind," Cheerilee said, as she disappeared into the shadows once more, leaving Rarity to struggle against her chains, in vain, dangling about